She told the story with a smile that was sharp enough to cut glass. "We're doing something beautiful for the town," she said, like the words themselves were a gift. Behind her, the billboard showed the developer's rendering. A sleek promenade, glass storefronts, a children's park with fake grass that would never wear down. I had grown up on that stretch of river. I knew every crooked dock, every sandbar where kids learned to skip stones, every sagging step that led down to the water. My grandfather had once bought the mill for a handful of nickels and a promise, then fixed the roof with his own hands. The mill had laughed at storms for 90 years. Until a man in a suit decided it would be worth a condo tower. When they came to buy us out, they talked like philosophers. They offered phrases: economic revitalization, community uplift, heritage reinterpretation, and checks that looked big enough to buy a better life. Some neighbors took the money and left. Others argued until they were old. My grandfather refused. He said money could not buy the smell of the river in the morning, you could not put a price on the sound of a millstone. So they did what modern developers do when stubbornness gets in the way: they bought the people around him. They made living expensive. They hired lawyers to whisper doubt. They planted a story that the old mill was unsafe, condemned, a hazard. Code violations were found overnight. Roads were temporarily closed. A notice appeared one morning: the property would be seized under eminent domain for public interest. My grandfather died weeks later, his hands folded over the same wrench he had used to fix the roof for decades. Elise was the face of that deal. She cut ribbons and posed with architects. She smiled for the cameras while local news called the project a new era. She stood at the podium the day they tore down the mill and read the line about progress, as if it were scripture. The town watched wood and memory vanish beneath cranes. My blood ran stone cold that day. At first I thought the proper thing was rage. I screamed at boards, wrote letters, showed up at hearings. I signed petitions. They laughed politely. "We have permits," they said. The law smelled of paper and lawyers' cologne. It was a different language than the one my grandfather taught me, one that required signatures and silent compliance. Then I remembered how my grandfather built things. He didn't shout, he worked. He left careful marks in beams, not quarrels in the street. If I wanted the mill back, yelling at the sky wouldn't stop the wrecking ball. I needed a plan that used the same currency they understood: leverage, contracts, reputation. Revenge, I decided, would be a slow arithmetic. I started small. I learned the developer's calendar the way a fisherman learns tides. Ribbon-cutting dates. Investor dinners. The architect's favorite wine. I watched them move like a choreographed troupe and marked moments where my interference would be most costly. I read filings, not to shout about corruption but to find a hinge: an unpaid fee, a misfiled environmental assessment, a clause in the zoning application that had been carelessly left blank. I found a fissure in the concrete. The company's environmental impact report was outsourced to a third party, one of those small consultancies with a glossy site and cheap rates. The consultant had stamped the report without the required water samples. It was an oversight but a dam against the tide if someone knew how to turn a drip into a leak. Turning a drip into a leak takes patience and a few allies. I started knocking on doors: engineers who once worked on the mill, an old lawyer my grandfather had once helped, a woman who ran the local B&B and remembered exactly which nights contractors had left trucks idling by the river. None of them had much. Together we had time and truth. We collected proofs: receipts from the consultant showing payments from an account that routed through a shell company, photo timestamps of construction equipment in restricted zones, emails where Elisa's assistant joked about speeding the permit to make the board sleep easier. We were not saints, we were a jury of small-town ghosts. The documents were thin, but they sang a pattern when played in sequence. Next I needed pressure. Developers fear two things more than anything: delays and headlines. I could not get the national newspapers to care about our river, but I could make the investors care, the people who read balance sheets and call their brokers at 9 a.m. I traced the money, payments, escrow accounts, the holding company's silent address, and reached out to a firm in the city that specialized in compliance due diligence. They were not activists. They were auditors who noticed when a lead didn't match a test. They took the bait. Their audit was like a precise scalpel. It asked for raw water testing, for chain of custody notes, for the spot checks the consultants were supposed to perform. The consultant produced samples. Samples that, to anyone with a microscope, looked suspiciously similar. The city asked for retests. The retests failed. Chain of custody forms had been backdated. A technician's thumbprint on a sample tray couldn't be accounted for. The press never called these things poetic. They called them irregularities and started asking awkward questions. As the audit opened, my little network turned noisy. The B&B owner wrote a letter about the trucks at night. An old foreman produced a ledger with times when heavy equipment ran on protected soil. Each small testimony was a nail. Not dramatic, no chases, no screams. Just inconvenient truths stacked until the building that had been squatting on our history creaked. Elisa's public face hardened. She smiled less in interviews and sent spokespeople to apologize for administrative errors. But the investors weren't people who loved apologies. They loved returns. The project schedule slipped. Window orders for the condos were delayed. Deposits sat in limbo. The market hates suspense, it prefers certainty. As the calendar pages turned, that certainty became death. She called me once. She spoke into the phone like she was still standing at a ribbon, all grace. "What do you want?" she said. It was a clean question, economical. I could have screamed into the line or lied. Instead, I answered with something honest. I want what my grandfather built back. What I wanted was not vengeance in the sense of watching her burn. I wanted a repair. I wanted the water unfouled and the land that had been promised back to the people who remembered the mill's name. When she laughed, soft and surprised, I heard for the first time the emptiness that lay under her confidence. Negotiations are not a single moment, they are a braided rope. The more the investors fretted, the more concessions they wanted. Our audit produced an independent recommendation: remedial restoration, full remediation, and the inclusion of community stewardship in future development plans. The consultant's liability was flagged. The holding company offered a settlement. Money, a glossy plaque, a public relations campaign. I refused the plaque. I refused the money that would dissolve responsibility. The town didn't need lipstick on its wound. Instead, I pushed for a different fix. The developer would fund a community cooperative, transfer ownership of a parcel to a local trust, and submit to seasonal environmental oversight, with a board that included the people who had fished the river all their lives. Took months. Elise argued, negotiated, flattered, and threatened. I answered with forms, with witness statements, with every stubborn document that lined our case. The pressure worked the way cold water works on a stone: slow, small, inevitable. In the end, they signed. The holding company agreed to hand over a parcel of land to the trust in exchange for modified permits. The consultant paid a penalty and lost accreditation. The mill's foundation, enough of it to matter, was preserved and turned into a community center. A place where kids could learn about carpentry and the river's history. They put a brass plaque on the wall. It didn't say anything about Elise. It said, "For those who remember." I walked past the ribbon cutting with a small crowd and felt nothing like the triumph the movies promise. There was no dramatic collapse, no last-minute confession that left the antagonist on her knees. Elise stood on the other side of the ribbon with a neutral smile. She gave a short speech about collaborative responsibility. No one booed. No one cheered differently. The truth had been restored, not as spectacle but as slow, bureaucratic correction. Revenge had not been about revenge at all. It was about making a choice, to pulverize another person's life or to rebuild what had been taken. I had done the latter, and as the kids ran around the newly repaired foundation, as the river lapped at pieces of stone that had once cradled a mill wheel, I understood what my grandfather had meant. You could not put a price on the smell of the river, but you could hold the people who sought to sell it accountable. You could make the ledger balance, not by vengeance that consumed, but by quiet insistence that some things are public goods, not private projects. That night, by the water, I sat on the steps and let the river talk. It sounded like the grandfather's stories, patient, irritable, impossibly persistent. I felt a slow, small peace. The cranes were gone. The billboard had been replaced with a mural painted by kids from the school. Elisa's name lived, as names do, in the records. My grandfather's hands, the ones that fixed the roof, were back where they belonged, in a photograph over the memos of a community trust. Revenge, I learned, is sometimes the act of returning what was stolen and then walking away. It tastes less like victory and more like a hand closing around something that had been lost, finally. I learned early on that small towns are porous. Secrets leak through barroom banter, through the kid who fixes printers at City Hall, through the woman who cleans the developer's office on weekends. If you listen long enough, patterns form. If you press politely and keep records, those patterns turn into proof. Step 1 was making noise where it mattered. I began with the people who read balance sheets, not op-eds. Auditors, compliance officers, and the kind of lawyer who smelled of old books and had a family farm in the next county. I didn't want spectacle. I wanted leverage. Leverage gets you hearings. Hearings get you a pause, and a pause costs developers money. I mapped their calendar until it felt like a second skin. Investor meetings, permit deadlines, a gala where Elise would be front and center. I put small, surgical pushes under those events. An anonymous packet to an out-of-state compliance firm before an investor meeting. A certified letter that flagged a missing water test the week before a big permit vote. And FOIA request that made City Hall shuffle like a deck of cards. No fireworks, just friction. What surprised me was how many people were quietly willing to help. The consultant who'd rubber-stamped the impact report had a teenage daughter who tutored my neighbor's kids. The accounting clerk who routed payments through shell companies had a drinking problem and a conscience that unlocked after a few questions. The old foreman who kept a ledger in a cardboard box had a habit of keeping receipts like talismans. People want to be on the right side when the light turns on. They hate the idea of having been used. We assembled a file no one could blame on rumor. Chain of custody notes, backdated memos, emails where a project manager joked about creative timelines. I printed them in sets and sent them with polite cover letters to the auditor, the regional environmental agency, and a legal watchdog in the city. The momentum was bureaucratic and beautiful. Officials don't like being surprised, and their verbs are slow but consequential. They opened inquiries. They demanded retests. Contractors were called back to the site. At the same time, I worked the other lever: investors. Money has a faithful heart. A single overdue window order will do more than 10 op-eds. I found the institutional partner who underwrote half the project and sent them a short, cold email. Your exposure. Water contamination risk. Attached, chain of custody anomalies. The reply was immediate. An investigator was dispatched. The investors' risk team asked for details. The holding company felt it on their balance sheet before they felt it in their pride. Elise noticed the change before the public did. She started calling my phone, polite at first, then sharp. We can correct paperwork, she said. We can make this right. That was the classic developer pitch. Purchase the headlines, buy time, smooth the cracks. I never met her on her terms. I answered every call with the same sentence. Fix the mill. Fix the river. Transparent oversight. No plaques. When you turn the screws on leverage, the other side flails. They began to play defense, lawyers, cease and desist letters, a friendly op-ed planted in a state paper about stifling progress. They hired consultants to review the auditor's methods. They staged a ribbon-cutting photo op during a week when the local reporter was on vacation. But the documents we had were slow poison. Each one undermined the next talking point. You can't loudly tout safety while the retest fails. Pressure breeds mistakes. The consultant tried to cover a gap with a backdated sample, and the lab flagged the chain inconsistency. An invoice surfaced showing a payment routed through a holding company whose listed address was a mail drop in another state. A supplier quietly emailed me, terrified, admitting they'd been pressured to rush orders and had concerns about runoff from the site. The supply chain that feeds a project is as fragile as a choir. When one voice wavers, the harmony collapses. I remember the afternoon the council put a temporary injunction on the construction schedule. It wasn't the end, but it was an axle shift. Permits were paused. Lenders started asking for new assurances. Deposits were frozen. Elise made a public apology that sounded practiced and thin. Somewhere in the town, a generator that fed a tour bus that would have brought investors sat idle. The project's timetable, its carefully plotted promise of dollars, suddenly had a hole in it. That hole was where leverage met narrative. We gave reporters the documents, but we didn't sensationalize. We gave them context. The mill's history, the kids who used to fish near the dock, the receipts for water tests that weren't done. A mid-tier regional paper ran an investigative piece with my name on it. The week after, a trade journal aimed at municipal bond underwriters flagged irregularities. The developer's PR team scrambled to issue statements. Their boilerplate sounded brittle against the weight of records. Not everyone was happy with the way things were going. My phone buzzed one night with a string of threats, the kind that read like a hand in a dark room. Someone keyed my neighbor's truck. An email threatened to expose some undisclosed skeleton in my past if I didn't back off. The message was clumsy, but its point was precise. The smaller nodes in their network were expendable. They expected me to flinch. I didn't flinch. I couldn't. This was no longer only about the mill. It was about what happens when a town sells its memory for a profit. If I retreated now, the pattern would spread. Other places would watch and learn. We escalated in kind, but not with theatrics. We filed a citizen suit asking for a full environmental remediation plan. We asked for independent sampling with witnesses. We mobilized the community into oversight. Fishermen's schedules were logged, kids' swim days were monitored. A local artist started a mural showing the mill in its prime. The town's voice grew louder because it was filled with small, credible facts. Elise's veneer cracked in quieter ways. I watched her at council meetings, the practiced smiles faltering when an elderly woman asked about well water. I watched her personnel change. One PR head replaced by another who used softer language. Power bends when the costs add up. The investigators were methodical. The developers were fastidious at lawyering, but the truth is porous when enough people breathe on it. The climax of the second act wasn't a showdown so much as a fulcrum. A satellite image surfaced, an old aerial photograph I'd found in a town archive, showing a drainage pattern the consultant had claimed didn't exist. An independent hydrologist testified that the developer's plans would divert runoff into a protected wetland under seasonal flood conditions. The investor who had been quietly listening called a special meeting. Their question was simple: do we want to be known for building bathrooms with a view on top of a poison marsh? The answer came, but it was not theatrical. The investor requested a pause and an escrow review. The holding company's credit lines were re-examined. The construction crews stopped for a week. The delay as practice began to feel like punishment. For the first time since the bulldozers arrived, the project encountered real resistance that cost them time and money. I will not pretend we didn't grow tough in the process. I found myself losing patience with compromise when it felt like capitulation. One night, after a particularly nasty letter from Elise's counsel accusing me of interfering with lawful development, I sat on the hood of my car and let the town's river speak to me. The muscle in my jaw hurt from tension. I realized revenge had a temperature. Warm at first, then burning, then cooling into something else. I feared the burn. We pushed until the point where offers came in earnest. A public fund, a compromise plan that included a scaled-back project and a community trust. Elise came to the table, not with charm but with urgency. The investor didn't want headlines or regulatory headaches. They wanted an exit that looked decent. I wanted more than a decent exit. I wanted stewardship. In the end, we threaded the needle. The company agreed to preserve a parcel, to fund restoration, and to submit to independent oversight for 5 years. The consultant lost accreditation. The investor quietly shifted funds to a new, stricter vehicle. The bulldozers left. That night, the river sounded different, less like a wound and more like a thing that had been tended. Kids climbed on preserved stones. The mural grew more colors. My neighbor's old dog wagged at me like nothing had happened, or like everything that had happened had already been forgiven by muscles that don't keep grudges. But the moral residue lingered. We had won something vital, yet not all the compromises felt clean. A parcel preserved is better than a condo, but the town table still bore the scars of negotiation. Elise still walked the corridors of regional development, if less warmly than before. Some of the people who'd left with money did not come back. The consultant paid fines but didn't go to jail. The holding company rebounded under new management. Our victory was practical, not cinematic. I stood on the mill steps at dusk and let the river unwind my shoulders. The cranes were gone, and the plaster smell from the demo had faded. But I'd seen what power could do when it wanted something. The fight had taught me the architecture of leverage and the cost of wielding it. I had given people back their ground, but I had not been spared the way fighting changes a person. There would be more whispers, more small fights over men and maps. The next morning I would get up and do the same useful work. Files, affidavits, calls. For now, the town had its river, and the children had a place to build rafts again. That was enough to make me keep going. The revenge had become a stewardship, and in that shape it felt less like vengeance and more like repair. The day the demolition trucks rolled back into town, I was already waiting. Only this time they weren't coming for me, they were coming for her. 6 months had passed since I'd started pulling at the threads of the project. What began as a quiet act of grief had turned into a full-scale unraveling. Every bribe, every falsified permit, every environmental violation was documented, cross-checked, and leaked, carefully, methodically. I didn't post it all at once. I let it drip out slowly like water through the cracks of a dam. Each week another document surfaced. Each time another reporter called. And slowly the name Riverside Development Group began to rot in public. Alice tried to control the narrative. She went on local news, smiled into cameras, said it was fake news. But when one of her partners flipped and sent me an encrypted file showing her signature on the bribery contracts, the tide turned. I didn't go to the police right away. I wanted the people to see it first. So I sent the files to every journalist who had ever written about the mill. Within 48 hours the story went viral. Riverside developer faces corruption probe. Historic mill demolished under false pretenses. And my favorite headline, small town man outsmarts corporate empire. The same papers that had once called me bitter, were now calling me brave. I didn't feel brave. I just felt tired. The investigation spread like wildfire. The mayor resigned. Inspectors were fired. Alice was subpoenaed. Her investors pulled out one by one. And the empty land where my grandfather's mill once stood, where they had promised luxury condos, was now a fenced-off wasteland, covered in mud and forgotten blueprints. Justice wasn't clean. It never is. But it was something. One evening I drove down to the river. The same place where my grandfather used to sit at sunrise, whittling pieces of driftwood and humming some old tune I could never name. I parked by the water's edge and just listened. The air smelled like rain. The river was high again, swollen from spring storms. I could almost hear his voice. The river remembers, kid. Always does. They thought destroying the mill would erase us. Instead, it reminded everyone what was lost. A group of locals had started a small petition online. Something about turning the land into a memorial park. At first I didn't care. I was done with this town. But then I saw the name of the petition, Millstone Park. Named after my grandfather's mill. And under it, hundreds of signatures, people I hadn't spoken to in years. For the first time in months, I felt something warm spread through my chest. Not revenge. Not triumph. The court case dragged on. Alice pled not guilty, of course. Claimed she'd been misled by her team. But when the jury saw the documents with her signature, the same one I'd stared at for weeks in my dark kitchen, they didn't buy it. She was sentenced to 8 years. I didn't attend the trial. Instead, I went to the edge of the river one last time. The city had approved the memorial. They were rebuilding a small water wheel, not to grind grain but to honor what was there. Kids would come see it. Families would picnic by it. The water would keep turning just like it used to. As I stood there watching the river push against the new wheel, I realized something. Revenge hadn't brought me peace. Truth had. But the two had walked hand in hand the whole way. I smiled faintly and whispered into the wind. For you, Grandpa. And then I turned, walked back to my truck and drove away. Not to escape but to start again. Behind me the water kept moving. And this time it carried my name with it.